One 14-year-old boy, a mother of three, and a federal agent all shot and killed. This is the story of Ruby Ridge, a siege that never should have happened, a tragedy that fanned the flames of extremism, and a case study in how distrust, fear, and bad policy can get people killed. Now, this is a topic that I personally find super interesting because I live here in Idaho, and most people that I've talked to have never even heard of it. But before we get into anything, I just want to be clear and upfront. I do not believe that Randy Weaver was a hero. His beliefs were racist, conspiratorial, and fundamentally dangerous. This is a story about government overreach and the lack of an attempt to de-escalate a situation where no one had to die. Now let's get into it. So just who was Randy Weaver? The man at the center of Ruby Ridge wasn't famous, he wasn't a leader, he didn't write a manifesto or build a compound. But in the eyes of the US government, by 1992, he was dangerous enough to justify a full-blown siege. So where did he come from? Randy Weaver was born in 1948 in Iowa, small-town post-war America. He grew up in a strict religious household shaped by Cold War paranoia and rural conservatism. Weaver allegedly served as a Green Beret in the US Army during the Vietnam era. Now I say allegedly because some people say that he never made it through Special Forces training, but either way, he never saw combat. Still, the military shaped him, taught him about weapons, discipline, survival, and most importantly, his distrust of authority. When he left the service, he didn't exactly reintegrate into civilian life. He saw the world, especially the US government, as corrupt and decaying, and he wanted out. By the early 1980s, Weaver had married Vicky, a woman with even more apocalyptic religious beliefs than he had. She believed in the coming end of the world, a biblical reckoning. Randy believed the government was part of a satanic global conspiracy. So they packed up their kids and moved to northern Idaho near the Canadian border to live off-grid. No power, no plumbing, and no roads. Just the Weavers, their Bibles, and their guns. Here's the thing. Randy Weaver wasn't just some libertarian prepper. He wasn't off playing Little House on the Prairie. He surrounded himself, voluntarily, with some of the most extreme ideologies in America. In the late 80s, Weaver started attending meetings at the Aryan Nations, a white supremacist group headquartered just a few miles from his home. He didn't join officially. He claimed he didn't agree with everything that they believed, but he kept showing up. He spent time with the Christian identity believers, people who preached that white Europeans were God's true chosen people. And he talked openly about his distrust of Jews, Catholics, and what he called Zionist occupation government. Not subtle, not harmless, and it doesn't sound like a misunderstanding. And let's be absolutely clear here. Randy Weaver's beliefs were extreme. His worldview was built on paranoia, bigotry, and apocalyptic nationalism. And this is not a man to idolize. And this is not a story where I try to excuse that. But understanding how he thought and how the government responded is the key to understanding what came next. By 1989, Randy Weaver was on the radar of federal law enforcement. He was white, rural, radical, and armed. But he wasn't breaking the law until the ATF gave him the opportunity to, and that's where things started to unravel. To understand what happened at Ruby Ridge, we need to go back to the late 1980s. Randy Weaver wasn't just some backwoods recluse. He was a man who actively isolated his family from society, stockpiled weapons, and aligned himself, at least socially, with white supremacist groups. In 1989, Weaver and his wife Vicky moved their growing family to a remote cabin in the mountains of Boundary County, Idaho. They had no electricity, no running water, and no interest in neighbors. Vicky believed a biblical apocalypse was imminent, and Randy believed the federal government was a part of a satanic conspiracy. And the more they disconnected from the outside world, the more radical their worldview became. What brought the Weavers into the government's crosshairs wasn't their beliefs. It was a shotgun. Two, actually. In 1989, Randy Weaver was approached by an undercover informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or the ATF for short. The informant was embedded in the Aryan Nations, the neo-Nazi group based near Weaver's home. Weaver wasn't a full-fledged member, but he attended the meetings, and that was enough to put him on the ATF's radar. The ATS informant asked Weaver to saw off 2 shotguns, not just any modification, but to cut the barrel length just below the legal minimum. Now, under the National Firearms Act regulations, a shotgun must have a barrel of at least 18 inches and an overall length of at least 26 inches. Weaver trimmed them too short by about a ½ inch. On paper, this is an open and shut violation of federal firearms law, a felony. But let's be real. Weaver wasn't running guns. He wasn't trafficking across state lines. All he did was modify 2 shotguns at the request of the government's own informant, which is entrapment. Now, the ATF had their hook, though, and rather than simply arrest him, they saw leverage. After the illegal modifications, the ATF charged Weaver, but they didn't move to arrest him right away. Instead, they made him an offer. Become an informant and infiltrate the Aryan nations, and then report back. Weaver, however, refused, and from that moment on, the federal government considered him a problem to be solved instead of being a suspect to be questioned. Here's where things spiral into bureaucratic chaos, though. In January 1991, the government indicted Weaver for the shotgun modifications. He was notified of a court date, but the court date was actually incorrect. Weaver thought he was due in court in March. The actual date was February 20th, so obviously he never showed up. The court, however, was unaware of the mix-up and issued a bench warrant for failure to appear. And just like that, Randy Weaver became a fugitive, over a ½ inch of steel and a misprinted court date. The irony? Had the court corrected the error, Weaver likely would have appeared. Instead, the government escalated. They painted him as armed and dangerous, they claimed he was part of a violent white supremacist movement, and they began planning an arrest operation as if he was a domestic terrorist. To be clear, Randy Weaver did break the law. He did have extremist views, and he did refuse to cooperate. But the government created the conditions for confrontation. They baited him into a crime, botched the paperwork, then sent in armed agents to his cabin in the woods. And all of it was avoidable. What should have been a minor illegal weapons charge became a manhunt, and soon it would become something far worse. By late summer 1992, U.S. Marshals had been watching the Weaver property for months. Randy Weaver had missed his court date, yes, partly because of confusing and conflicting notices sent by different agencies, but instead of fixing their error or sending a local deputy, the government decided to escalate immediately. On August 21st, 6 marshals in full camo entered the forest surrounding the Weaver cabin to conduct reconnaissance. Their objective? Plan a safe way to arrest Randy without tipping off the heavily armed family. But there was a problem. This wasn't some neighborhood stakeout. This was remote Idaho, deep woods, and the Weavers were always on edge and always armed. Their dogs were their first line of defense. When the marshals crossed into their land, the family dog Striker started barking and took off toward the scent. Randy's 14-year-old son, Sammy, and Kevin Harris, a 24-year-old family friend staying with the Weavers, grabbed their rifles and followed the dog into the trees. And that's when everything went wrong. A marshal, later identified as Art Roderick, shot the dog, reportedly to keep the team from being detected. The moment the dog yelped, Sammy shouted, "You shot my dog, you son of a bitch," and fired a shot in their direction. The marshals returned fire. Kevin Harris fired back. One of his bullets hit and killed U.S. Marshal William Deegan. Sammy was shot in the arm and then fatally shot in the back while he was retreating, trying to run home. 2 people died in less than a minute. William Deegan, a deputy marshal, and Sammy Weaver, age 14, shot in the back while he ran away. The Weavers claimed that Sammy was executed while he was retreating. However, the government insisted it was a defensive action taken during a chaotic firefight. What's clear is that no one had a plan for this moment, and certainly no one had control. The marshals immediately pulled back, and they didn't try to recover Deegan's body. They called in backup, and within hours, the FBI's hostage rescue team was flying in from Quantico. This just wasn't quite an arrest anymore. This was a war footing. After the shootout that left a U.S. Marshal and a 14-year-old boy dead, the FBI took control of the situation. Within 24 hours, their elite hostage rescue team was on the ground, flying in from Virginia with armored vehicles, surveillance planes, and enough firepower to fight a war. The problem? This wasn't a war zone. It was a remote cabin in Idaho with 2 adult men, 1 teenage girl, and 1 woman holding a baby. And yet, the mindset was pure combat. Normally, the FBI operates under what's called the deadly force policy. It's pretty basic. You can only use lethal force if you or someone else is in immediate danger. That's a constitutional standard, one that applies from everyone, from beat cops all the way to federal agents. But Ruby Ridge was different. The FBI drafted a special set of rules of engagement for this operation. These weren't just tactical guidelines, they were deviations from federal law. The new rules stated, any adult male observed with a weapon prior to the announcement of surrender can and should be shot. Let that sink in. Not may shot if threatening, not fire if fired upon, can and should be shot. That's not law enforcement, that's a kill order. Notably, this wasn't a misinterpretation by a single agent on the ground. These rules of engagement were signed off on by multiple levels of FBI leadership, from tactical commanders to legal advisors. Even Larry Potts, the FBI's assistant director at the time, greenlit them. And yes, Potts would later play a similar role in the Waco siege. Different story, same problem. The effect was immediate and fatal. On August 22nd, just 1 day after the initial shootout, FBI sniper Lon Haruchi took up position on a ridge overlooking the cabin. Through his scope, he spotted Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris. First, he shot Weaver in the back of the shoulder while Randy was running toward the shed where his son's body lay. Then, seconds later, Haruchi fired again, this time at Harris, who was running into the cabin. That bullet would hit Harris, but it would also go straight through the front door and hit Vicki Weaver, who was standing right behind it, holding her 10-month-old daughter. The bullet entered her face, and she died immediately. But luckily, the baby survived. Vicki Weaver was unarmed and holding a baby. She was killed by an FBI sniper firing under rules that said anyone with a gun could and should be shot on sight. And the FBI didn't even know that she was dead. Haruchi claims that he had no idea that he had hit Vicki Weaver. For days, negotiators were calling into the cabin asking to speak with Vicki while her corpse lay inside, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by her children who thought that they were mocking them. These rules of engagement were later called unconstitutional by multiple internal reviews. The Department of Justice found that they had violated the Fourth Amendment. Even other FBI officials after the fact admitted that they should have never been approved, and yet no one was held criminally responsible for writing them, approving them, or using them. The sniper who fired the fatal shots, Lon Haruchi, he was shielded from prosecution twice. Also keep in mind, the sniper was also present in Waco just months later. This wasn't just bad judgment. It was policy written in fear, fueled by politics, and rubber stamped by authority. And the cost was paid by a mother in front of her children. By August 23rd, the remote cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho had become a fortress. Inside, Randy Weaver, wounded. Kevin Harris, severely wounded and slowly dying. Sarah Weaver, only 16 years old, terrified and exhausted. A 10-month-old baby, and the corpse of Vicki Weaver wrapped in a blanket. For 11 days, the family remained holed up, refusing to come out, surrounded by a small army of federal agents, state police, and military equipment. At its peak, over 400 personnel were deployed to this remote corner of Boundary County. Helicopters, snipers, Humvees, even armored personnel carriers, all against a wounded man, a teenager, a dying house guest, and a baby. The whole thing felt less like law enforcement and more like the government was laying siege to a castle. The FBI had established a forward operations base and was broadcasting demands via megaphone, saying things like, "We know you're inside, and come out with your hands up." What they didn't realize for days was that Vicki Weaver was dead. The agents kept calling for her to pick up the phone, oblivious to the fact that her body was laying cold just behind the cabin door. And inside, her children were listening. The psychological toll was immense. 16-year-old Sarah Weaver would later recount laying beside her dead mother's body for days, praying, grieving, and trying to care for a baby while surrounded by snipers. And yet, nobody inside the cabin was firing at the agents. There was no ongoing threat. The standoff dragged on, not because the Weavers were attacking, but because the government had already made lethal mistakes, and now they had no graceful way out. Behind the scenes, the narrative was shifting. The initial media framing that this was a shootout with a dangerous white supremacist began to erode under scrutiny. Journalists started asking why the ATF even pursued Randy Weaver so aggressively in the first place, why the court date he missed was changed, and why nobody corrected it, why the FBI had issued unconstitutional rules of engagement, and crucially, why did they kill an unarmed mother holding a baby? With public pressure mounting and no violence coming from inside the cabin, the FBI brought in Bo Gritz, a decorated Vietnam War veteran and far-right folk hero, to act as a negotiator. Gritz wasn't a federal agent. He was a part of the same anti-government culture that Randy Weaver had grown to idolize, but ironically, he is the one who de-escalated the situation. Gritz convinced Weaver that if he didn't surrender, his daughter and Harris would likely die in that cabin, either from gunfire or from infection. On August 30th, Randy Weaver finally came out carrying a small white flag, and Kevin Harris followed in critical condition. The siege was over, the cabin was bloodstained, broken, and silent, and America was about to have a long overdue conversation about what just happened. I want to be clear and reiterate, Randy Weaver held extreme, racist, anti-government views. He associated with white supremacists and placed his family in danger because of his own paranoia and stubbornness. But the government escalated a low-level, avoidable arrest into a militarized siege, killing a child and a mother in the process. Both sides made disastrous choices, but only one side had the legal and moral responsibility to uphold the Constitution. The siege at Ruby Ridge ended, but its impact was just beginning to ripple outward. In total, 3 people were dead: U.S. Marshal William Deegan, 14-year-old Sammy Weaver, and Vicki Weaver. Kevin Harris was critically wounded, and Randy Weaver had lost half of his family. The first trial was that of Kevin Harris, the family friend who had fired the shot that killed Marshal Deegan. The government charged Harris with first-degree murder, but the case quickly unraveled. His defense team argued, successfully, that Harris had fired in defense of Sammy after the federal agents had entered the property and shot the family dog. In 1993, after a high-profile trial, Harris was acquitted on all charges. Randy Weaver was tried next. The federal government threw the book at him. Failure to appear in court, assault on a federal officer, conspiracy, and murder, but the jury saw straight through it. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the idea that Weaver had planned a violent confrontation, but there was no evidence of that. In fact, much of the incident had started because of a confusing court summons and overreach by federal agencies. The jury convicted him only of the original minor charges, failing to appear in court and violating bail conditions. He was sentenced to 18 months and with time served was out almost immediately. Then came the investigations, because when a woman is killed by an FBI sniper and her body lies unburied in a cabin for 11 days, people start asking questions. In 1995, the Senate Judiciary Committee launched hearings into Ruby Ridge. Over the course of 10 days, they exposed a pile of bureaucratic failures, tactical missteps, and outright lies. Among the findings they found, the rules of engagement were ruled unconstitutional, FBI leaders withheld evidence during the investigation, a senior FBI official destroyed a report that criticized the agency's response, and several agents were recommended for criminal charges, though none were convicted. In 1995, the U.S. government quietly settled with the Weaver family. Randy received $100,000, and his daughters all received $1 million. But no apology came with the check, and no federal official served any prison time. As for Lon Horiuchi, the FBI sniper who killed Vicki Weaver, he was charged with manslaughter by the state of Idaho in 1997. but a federal judge ruled that he had immunity as a federal officer and the case was dismissed. He was never tried in court. And here's the dangerous part. Ruby Ridge didn't just expose flaws in federal law enforcement, it fed the flames of an already growing anti-government movement. Militia groups, white nationalists, and anti-federal extremists seized on the story, painting Randy Weaver as a martyr. To them, the message was clear. The government is coming for you, and you better be ready to shoot back. 3 years later, when the Oklahoma City bombing killed 168 people, including 19 children, bomber Timothy McVeigh cited Ruby Ridge and Waco as motivation. He was never inspired by Randy Weaver's beliefs. He was inspired by the government's brutality in response to those beliefs. That's why Ruby Ridge matters. Not because of Randy Weaver's ideas, which were extreme and disgusting, but because the government's overreaction turned him into a symbol, one that would be co-opted by violent, paranoid movements that live on today. Ruby Ridge was not just a law enforcement failure, it was a moral failure, a test of government restraint, and a moment when it failed spectacularly, in the most American of ways, with guns, confusion, and no one held accountable. So what do we take from this? It's easy to flatten this story into a culture war. Government tyranny versus rugged individualism. Woke feds versus real patriots. But the truth is, nobody wins here. The government overreached, used unconstitutional force, and killed its own civilians. Randy Weaver built a life on hate and fear and helped push others into that violence. This wasn't justice, it wasn't heroism, it was a failure, and a preventable one. If the government had used a knock instead of a sniper, or if Randy Weaver had faced his charges like anybody else, maybe no one would have died, and maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't still be living in the shadow of Ruby Ridge. Thank you everybody for watching. If you found this entertaining, please do me a favor and like the video below. Also, give me a follow if you want to see more content like this. All my sources will be in the description below. Do not hesitate to comment if I got any information incorrect or missed anything. Hope you all have a good one. See you on the next one.